Cambridge Insider Podcast time. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the greatest higher education podcast in the world. I said it. You can do what you want with me. I said it. I don't care. Co-host Leanna Glass, how are you?
I'm good. Bold statements here today. I'm doing well. I've got a huge thunderstorm outside my window, so I've let everyone know. I'm going to let our listeners know. If I disappear, I've lost power, and our amazing hosts of this show are going to take it from there.
Yeah, and we will post an update on the show notes to make sure that our listeners know that Leanna has made it through the storm. So good luck. If you are in the northeast of the US, we've had some crazy weather of late, not just the northeast, but specifically because, that's where the show gets recorded. Good luck with the little crazy weather, but all over the US, we've seen a little bit of crazy weather over the last little bit. It's a very exciting episode because our listeners, for the very first time, after probably getting more mentions than LeBron James in an NFL, in an NBA season, our executive producer, Dean, is joining us on this episode. Dean, how are you?
I'm well. Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you for being the executive producer. I think there's a lot of things that you do that, our listeners don't always maybe know about. So we appreciate you keeping the ship running. Both Leanna and I are indebted to your excellent, knowledge of producing and making sure that these get recorded and get put out there for the public to consume every single day. Dean, don't you want to tell us just a little bit about yourself, very briefly, just a little bit about yourself, so that our listeners know you as more than just the executive producer?
Sure. In addition to producing this podcast, I also serve as a regional director of program management, dealing with schools and doing business development at Cambridge. So that's been pretty much my role for the past couple years. But before that, I was in student services. I kind of bounced around. I've been with the company for almost 7 years. So I've worn a lot of hats.
Awesome. You also, correct me if I'm wrong, you also lived in China for some time?
I did, yes. Prior to working with Cambridge, I was in China teaching, studying, doing random stuff.
Awesome. So a wealth of knowledge, and it's awesome to have you on the episode. Leanna, I feel like you want to introduce it or want to say something, so go ahead. I apologize. I'm talkative today.
Well, I just know that our executive producer, Dean, has a really interesting background in what he studied. So I would like to know what you studied in school.
Oh, that's like a few episodes. I used to study
briefly
anything that would interest me. So that's the brief thing. So there's no rhyme or reason to what I studied. Honestly, like I was in undergrad, I was a politics major. And then I studied Near Eastern Studies, which was a certificate. It's kind of like the equivalent of a minor. And I was also a pre-med. So I was interested in politics because there was a professor that was head of the Socialist Party in Italy. And he was such a rhetorician. Like he taught Cicero, and I just walked into the class. It was in one of the biggest lecture halls at the school. I just walked in class. It was during the time where you can audit and choose which classes you want to do. And he kept talking about the Prince, Niccolo Machiavelli's The Prince, and he kept saying, "My dear Niccolo," and he wrote a book about it and stuff like that. And he used to ride around with a little communist hat and his bike around campus. It's very a character, and he would just orate so well. And he said, this is how you wield power, through words. And literally his class, everybody was spellbound. So I became a politics major because of Maurizio Veroli. And then the Near Eastern Studies, I was interested in studying Arabic. So I studied Arabic for 4 years. And then the pre-med, I've always wanted to go into medicine, which I did after. So
thank you for that
interesting,
wonderful question.
That's why. Yeah, I just really needed to give our listeners a bit of background into who we are interviewing today.
That is a bit of a fun episode because the three of us don't often get to, we never get to record together. So here we are. So bear with us. We do actually have a topic in mind that we do want to share with our listeners. Ultimately, you're driving in a car, you're sitting on a train, you're somewhere, maybe you're in class. If you are, take the earphones out, listen to your teacher. But you are listening to our podcast for a reason. And specifically today, we want to discuss a little bit of something that's been swirling around international education for quite some time. You'll often hear people talk about the economies, specifically the economies of countries, sending countries, so countries where students would come from. And this makes somebody who maybe like myself, who's not that into finance and economy and how all of that works, but it does make sense that if you have a country and those, the population of that country has more money, they are able to send students abroad to go and study. It's typically an endeavor which is more expensive than studying back home, or studying closer to home at least. So we did want to address just a little bit about what's happening economically around the globe, specifically, I think, related to China. So, Dean, 30-second synopsis here in terms of the economic situation as we look at it right now, and we'll delve in further on that in terms of what it means for our industry.
Okay, so I guess there's so much to say about this topic. I want to be very focused in how it relates to our industry and the subject of this podcast. So recently, what happened was news got broken that this company called Evergrande, which is it's such a large company. They own about 4% of real estate worldwide, or in China, rather, and they defaulted basically on their loans. They took a lot of debt and they couldn't pay it back. This isn't something new, though. It's literally been a slow-moving train wreck. It's just for some reason, I think because the deadlines for their debt repayment have come due or will be due in a few days. So this is big news. But people have known about this for some time in the financial circles. How it relates specifically to our industry is that it affects the Chinese economy and the world economy. Okay, and so first and foremost, the Chinese economy is affected because it's just such a big part of the GDP. So something will have to be done. We don't know exactly what things are being done right now, but that's a little bit beyond the scope of this podcast. As it relates to a disposable income, students, parents, families being able to afford international education in America and Europe, it has an effect. It means that people are going to be a little more frugal. They're going to be a little more careful with how they spend their money, because a lot of money is tied up into real estate in China. It's just one of the main ways that people make investments.
Dean, just a quick, I'm gonna just specifically for myself more than for anybody else, but I do think it'll help the listeners. I want to dumb it down even more. So what you're saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that the Chinese economy, and China being a big sender of students to the US specifically, but the Chinese economy is a little sluggish, is struggling a little bit. Basically, people have less money. The average person maybe has less money in their bank accounts, less money in their pockets, and therefore are able to send less students to the US. Is that a good synopsis of where we're at?
Yes, and for two main reasons. And this is important because there are macroeconomic factors affecting our business, affecting how many students you see in international schools, in schools in the US or around the world. How many international students are just moving. These factors really, really affect it. And one of the main reasons for there being less money is, one, COVID. It affected the entire world's economy, and it kind of had a detrimental effect on disposable income. The second being this default or this cratering of the real estate market in China, which, even if it gets resolved, it will have an effect.
All right. So again, going to just keep dumbing things down. Leanna, feel free to jump in. I know you're also absorbing a lot of this information because Dean certainly has the insights here. We had these events, COVID specifically, something that a lot of people can relate to because everybody's gone through it. The economies, in China specifically has come down. Less students are ultimately coming to the US. What does that mean for two groups of players in this industry? Number one, for our schools. What does this mean where we are right now? Is this the end of the industry? What should they be thinking? What can they be doing?
Not at all the end. Markets move in waves and cycles. It's always, and that's just like a natural pattern of things. There's ups and downs. There's bull markets and bear markets. So we could say, with respect to China specifically, we're at an inflection point. We may be entering a mini bear market, if you will. So what that means for schools is you have to diversify. No longer is it that you can put all your eggs in one basket and expect all of your sort of international students to come from one market and paying one price point. You need to be a little savvy as to how you get your foot into other markets and find that disposable income in those sort of emerging markets, as we call them at Cambridge.
And I'm going to stop you. I'm going to stop you right there. I know you've got a second point, but I do want to add to that before we move on from that point. So it's about diversifying into, Vietnam and Korea and offering potential scholarships or discounted prices to be able to, recruit students from those markets. Is it fair to say, and this is something that at Cambridge we've been speaking about, in addition to that, because the Chinese market specifically is very saturated in terms of the number of students that are arriving, or the US market is saturated to China and to Chinese students, it is also about differentiating yourself as a school. So understanding if, yes, there are less students coming, the number of schools in the US, and this is something we've said for years, hasn't really changed. So we go back to something like Cambridge Enhanced Marketing as an example of a way in which you can differentiate yourself, in which you can rise to the top of the other 2,000, 5,000, 10,000 schools to make sure that the few students from China that are coming in are seeing you and that you're the one up there putting your name in front and that you don't get lost amongst the rest of the schools.
Absolutely. So yeah, there are a few ways that you can go about it. If you're a school, you can, one, look to market yourself more aggressively through, funded marketing campaigns, targeted marketing campaigns in whatever market that you're looking to grow in. If it's China, right, you use a program like CEM, Cambridge Enhanced Marketing, like you just sort of mentioned, or you look into being available in those expanded or sort of those ancillary markets by making sure your price point is sort of appropriate to those markets. So that's the big thing. A lot of schools say, yeah, I'm totally interested in availing myself to Brazilian students and to German students and to West African students and to Latin American students, but they forget the big piece of that is making sure you meet them where they can even think about affording you. So you have to look at the price point, the average sort of purchasing power in that country. You have to find a way where your tuition makes sense for the majority of people in that market, or else there's no hope, right?
All right.
And I'm just going to jump in here and say that to our listeners, I'm doing a lot of listening myself because I'm in no way an economics master, and I'm doing a lot of learning here on this episode, but I do think we've, quote, dumbed it down a lot for our listeners, and it makes sense. Schools are going to have to pivot and meet students and customers where they're at. They're not going to be able to expect that even our China market is going to be able to pay maybe what they could in the past. Things are changing. COVID has affected that, and the economy is going to continue to change. And it sounds like China is going to be entering a bit of a rough patch.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a great point. Even for the China market, if you're looking at schools, institutions to recruit from that market, you should think of doing it at a lower price point because the numbers are not going to be there at, the previous price points, in 2015, 16, where, people were paying exorbitant sums, if we want to be honest, for an education. That's not going to happen anymore. Or it doesn't look like it will.
And with an economy that's not doing so great, parents have to reprioritize. And they're going to have to make changes and spend their money in different places than they normally would have, having the market in a better spot. So, absolutely. Yeah, it makes sense to me.
Yeah,
I've always wanted to say it's a matter of economics. Always wanted to say that. And this seems like the appropriate place to say that. Dean, a final question, because I think we've done well just to sort of, encapsulate this idea for us. For students that are listening, does this change the game for them in any way, do you think? Or is it very much continue to just apply in the way in which you've applied? Does this mean more choices for students? Does this mean students have to be aware of something that maybe they're not seeing initially? And if there's nothing, that's fine. We'll have them move on from there. But I do want to be able to add some value to them if there is.
This is a student's market, so it's no longer what it was for schools. Schools don't necessarily have the upper hand anymore. There's not like a pool of money and disposable income just sitting waiting for them to apply to these tuitions. Now schools are hunting students more so than students hunting schools, and that we've seen that change, and we've noticed that, and we've mentioned that on this podcast. So given the state of the market and kind of I don't want to use an economic term, but basically the purchasing power in most of these markets getting stronger, because you're going to experience a bit of deflation. I don't want to lose anybody, but if there's less money going about and things are kind of slowing down, you're ultimately going to go into deflation. When you were kind of printing money and kind of providing, I don't want to say bailouts, but you were providing some respite for people because of COVID. Now it's going to slow down. You're going to reverse, and you're going to get a bit more deflationary, and the purchasing power of every unit of fiat currency in these different markets is going to heighten. So naturally, you're going to have lower prices. And so students are going to have more of an opportunity to study abroad at better prices. That's basically it. So I encourage all students listening, ask for a scholarship, try and get into the schools that you previously couldn't afford, and say, hey, this is what I'm willing to pay, because more and more schools that are willing and looking and really keen on recruiting international students are going to do so at a lower price point.
And I will say as well to students, when you do have a lot of options, it's easy to get lost in the noise a little bit. I would urge all families and all students to look for value. I know one of the things that we preach from our side and try and instill in our school partners, and I think we've been very successful because we have amazing school partners at Cambridge Network, but they offer incredible value to their students, both in terms of, and I think a big word here is support, so the academic support that either the school or the network around the school can offer, but also the social, emotional homestay support, whether that be in the dormitory or as a homestay option that students we see time in, time out, the best students that are academically incredibly gifted, that you think are going to be incredibly successful, require both that academic as well as that social, emotional homestay or dormitory type of support. So look into, as a student, as a family, into the value, because it's easy to get lost in the noise. Schools come at you with a lot. Make sure that they are offering, that value. I want to be conscious of time, as we always are on the Cambridge Network or the Cambridge Insider podcast. Leanna Glass, I'm going to start with you, because in a previous episode, I didn't give you final thoughts, and there was a big, I mean, social media went wild. You were devastated. It was a big thing around the world. Any final thoughts from your side?
I have to say, I don't have a ton of final thoughts on this episode. Our executive producer used a lot of big words that I'm not going to lie. There were some things I didn't understand, but I think we did do a good job dumbing things down enough to understand how it relates to our schools and our students. So I encourage our students to reach out, I encourage our schools to reach out for ways that you can kind of rebrand, remarket, and meet students and families where they need to be met. If these economic factors are going to affect what they can and can't afford anymore, what they can and can't prioritize. So just continue to communicate with us, and we'll help you market yourselves the best you can.
Absolutely. Yeah. And what I'm going to do is executive producer Dean, even though he was on the podcast episode, I'm going to have him post two links for our listeners, specifically for students. I'm going to have him post a link where they can have a look at some of the schools that we have in the network, just specifically because we know that they add incredible value to a student's journey. So if you are looking for a safe way to find a great value-driven school, you'll find it in those bunch of schools that work with the Cambridge Network. So I'm going to have executive producer Dean put a link or a document up there for you, and then specifically related to Cambridge Enhanced Marketing as well, for schools that are looking to elevate themselves, differentiate themselves. We'll put something up about CEM, Cambridge Enhanced Marketing, for our school listeners as well. Dean, I am a little bit tentative to do this, but I will do it just because I'm a good guy. Any final thoughts from your side?
I would just say, in supplement to what Leanna said, to students, definitely do your research. And if you're looking, as Stephen said, for a school, look for value. And there are tons of great schools that aren't necessarily at the highest prices, but that offer so much to students. And you can find those by reaching out to your Cambridge representative, and they'll definitely key you in as to, what's available in different areas, and, what you like, what you don't like. They're experts in these different schools. We have a large network of schools. So definitely do your research and ask around.
Awesome. As always, Dean, thank you. Thank you for being the executive producer and for joining us on this episode. My co-host, Leanna Glass, thank you for your wild contributions today. And then to all of our listeners, remember to like, subscribe, do all of those good things, share the podcast. This has been a fascinating episode that's delved into something a little bit different, but it all relates back to what we're doing in this industry. We believe in the industry. It's important for us to keep it going. And we do that by, these business practices and these insights that we provide for our listeners. Until the next episode, we'll catch you around. Bye-bye, everybody.